Hi, y'all. So I got into a terrible fight with my mom a couple of days back on the day of my wedding, or rather after everything was done with. It was completely her fault, but recently, I spoke to my grandma and unintentionally created even more trouble for her, and that's why I decided to come to ask if what I did was justified or not. I am 24F, and have been with my partner 24M for the past 10 years. We started dating in high school and he's the love of my life, so this wedding was a huge deal for me. We got engaged last year and have been planning this for months because we wanted it to be an event that people would remember. Both he and I had even saved up a ton of money to finance this, and my mom didn't care a bit about any of that. My parents are divorced. They ended their marriage when I was 6 years old and had been co-parenting me after that. They never got along, and honestly, I can't imagine how they even made their marriage last for as long as they did, since they had been married for almost 3 years when I was born, and then they continued to stay together for 6 more years before they finally parted ways. Most kids are quite unhappy when their parents tell them that they are going to get divorced, but when they explained to me what was going on, I was thrilled. For me, it meant that they were not going to be fighting every day anymore, and if they were happy, it would mean that I would finally have a shot at being happy as well. So as a kid, I was quite content with their decision, and they had shared custody of me, so I would spend half the month at my dad's place and the other half at my mom's. Unfortunately, though, I had celebrated a bit too early because I didn't realize that, even in a co-parenting arrangement, they would have to at least speak to each other and be on the same page about me, and they would struggle even with that. They were always bad-mouthing each other whenever they were around me, and I would always feel like I was caught in the middle. My parents believed that even after the divorce, the other was bent on making life difficult for them, and I tried to be understanding as a kid, but by the time I reached middle school, I had had enough. So, I just snapped while I was staying with my dad, and once again, he had had some fight with my mother about me because she had wanted to change the timings when she was going to take me back since she had some event coming up, and my dad was not fine with it. I had started to feel like a burden to both of them by then, so I decided to try and make a run for it. I was just 12 years old at the time, and after I heard my dad fighting on the phone with my mother, and then, inevitably, he started talking crap about her in my presence, I went back to my room, and in the middle of the night, I packed a few of my things and I left. I still remember that night because I don't think I've ever done anything that stupid after that, since I literally didn't have a plan at all and I thought I was just going to wing it. I remember going to the bus station that night, but since there was just one creepy guy there, I walked back to a park near my house and thought that I would go back to the bus station in the morning as soon as I woke up. Luckily, I fell asleep at the park and nothing happened to me. By the next morning, my dad had realized that I was missing and informed the cops, and I was brought back home, safe and sound. Obviously, once my parents realized that I had tried to run away from home, they confronted me about what I was going through, and I told them that they had made me feel like a burden because of how they constantly kept fighting because of me, and that was when they promised that they would try to be kinder to each other for my sake, since they had never expected me to take such an extreme step because of their behavior. After that incident, my dad stayed true to his word, and even when he would fight with my mother, he wouldn't say anything to me about it so I wouldn't have to feel guilty, but my mother would occasionally forget and end up ranting about my dad to me. It made things a bit difficult for me because honestly, I love both my parents and I don't think that they were the villains. I just think that they found it impossible to get along with each other, and that was what made their job of parenting me so hard. It's obviously not easy to raise a kid together when you hate each other, but at least my dad tried his best. My mom, well, let's just say that she didn't take her word as seriously as my father did, and so, eventually, I started growing closer to my dad instead. I would still spend time with her when I would go over to her place when it was her turn to have me, and we would have a nice time together. So it's not like I loved her any less, but I just felt more connected to my dad. And after I grew up and left for college, it was my dad who stayed in touch with me more as compared to my mother. So right now, I would obviously say that I do prefer my dad over my mom. However, I have still always treated them both with the same kind of love and respect, but what happened recently was just way too entitled for me to handle, which is why I ended up lashing out at her. My parents dated other people as well after their divorce, and my dad decided to get married again about 4 years ago. He had been dating my stepmom for almost 3 years by then, and they were quite serious, so it made sense for him to get married again, since before that, he had only had a couple of relationships that led nowhere. My mother had a slightly different approach. She would only have flings and refuse to commit to anyone after the divorce, even if the other guy was interested. I'm not judging her, that's her choice and I respect that. But then, she randomly called me a couple of months back, maybe 6 months ago, and told me that she had been seeing a guy for a few months and the two of them had decided to get married, so she wanted me to be there at the wedding. It was all very sudden and rushed, and I had no idea what was going on, but she told me that she was just sure of this guy and he seemed to be sure of her too. Besides, she had fun for many years, but now, she wanted somebody to be there for her. Her husband, James, fake name, had only been with my mom for about 4 months when they got married, and the two of them seemed to be in love with each other, but I was very skeptical of their relationship. For starters, he was much younger than her, almost by a decade, and obviously, there was also the fact that they had known each other for very little time. It was he who had suggested that they get married, and my mother had constantly been talking about it at the wedding. but I don't think she realized that it was not the thing that she thought it was because it only made the situation seem even more fishy. I tried to talk to her about it, but she brushed me off and told me that she was sure of this decision, so I didn't perceive it further since I didn't want to come off as judgmental, and for what it's worth, he actually seemed pretty into her. So I attended the wedding, along with a couple of her close friends and a few relatives, and I even wished them the best. When I told my father about all of this, even he was quite surprised that she had gotten married to somebody whom she had barely known for a few months, but by then, it was already done. And after that, I got too busy with planning my own wedding to care about what was going on with my mom and James, since they seemed happy enough. For the past 6 months, they have been married, and I have rarely seen her since she spends all her time traveling with him. She did not even attend my bridal shower, but I didn't have any complaints. However, the night before my wedding, when we were all at the hotel, she knocked on my door and told me that she had something very important to discuss with me. So I let her in, and that was when she chose to tell me that she had overheard me talking to my dad about walking me down the aisle and stuff, and even at the rehearsal dinner, she had thought that I would ask James to do it, but I hadn't, even though I had already asked her. I was having both my parents walk me down the aisle because I thought that would be more suited to my family dynamics, and I didn't want my mom to feel left out, but I didn't know what she was even talking about by referring to James. I was honestly baffled why she would even think that because I had known James for a couple of months and as long as my dad was alive, I was not going to pick some random guy to walk me down the aisle on my wedding day. To me, James was not my stepdad, but just my mom's husband, and I made it very clear to her. I told her that I had no intention of asking James at any point, and if she had believed that I was going to do so, then she had clearly been mistaken. I had never even indicated or hinted that I would ask him, so I had no idea why she had suddenly started believing something like this. It was simply ridiculous, and to make matters worse, when she realized that I was serious, and I was actually going to have my biological father walk me down the aisle instead of her husband, she started throwing a tantrum in my room and told me that if that was the case, then she and James would not be attending at all. Because apparently, she had believed that I was closer to her, and by extension, James would be the one to walk me down the aisle along with her. Apparently, another reason she had expected me to ask James and not my dad was that she believed that she and her father walking me down the aisle would send the wrong message, and it might also make James feel a bit insecure. So she kept throwing her tantrum, and I didn't have time for that, especially not on the night before my wedding because I needed my sleep, so I put an end to it by telling her that if she didn't want to attend the wedding, she was free to leave along with James, and then I asked her to leave my room so I could go to sleep, and that was it. The next morning, when I woke up, my mother was nowhere to be seen, and I explained what had happened the previous night to everyone close to me, including my immediate family, my husband, and my bridesmaids. I was obviously going to be busy for the rest of the day, so I didn't even have time to think about her, and I'm pretty grateful for it because that probably would have ruined my vibe. My dad and stepmom ended up walking me down the aisle eventually, and a few people had confused looks, but nobody said anything since it was obvious that I wanted it to be a good day, without any controversies. I like my stepmom, so I didn't mind her walking me down the aisle, and the wedding went smoothly. But 1 hour before all the celebrations were going to end, my mom showed up along with James at the reception, and she had a very sheepish look on her face, so I knew that she was here to apologize. I had been drinking and I was riding high on the happiness of just having gotten married, so I didn't mind her coming back for the reception, and I was more than ready to forgive her. So when she apologized, I told her that I accepted her apology and she was free to join everybody else, but instead, she stayed by our side and she told me that she actually had a favor to ask of us, and then said that she wanted us to redo the wedding ceremony so she could be a part of it as well. Both my husband and I were shocked because it was just an absurd request to make, and we obviously declined it immediately because we were not going to do that. But then, she started requesting us, and even James was looking quite worried, so he told us that she really needed us to do this for her as a favor because otherwise, my grandma would cut her off. Both my dad's parents attended the wedding, but unfortunately, my grandma, my mom's only surviving parent, was unable to attend because she lives out of state and has a lot of health conditions that prevent her from traveling. So I had promised her that I would send her a video of the wedding, and while my mom and James had been driving back home, my grandma had decided to video call my mother so she could speak to me, and that's when my mom had realized that she had screwed up. And now, she was scared of what her mother would have to say about her behavior at my wedding, which is why she wanted me to redo the ceremony so she could be a part of it, and my grandma wouldn't be able to find out about what exactly had happened. My mom honestly thought that it was a realistic solution since the venue was paid for, the decorations were still up, and most of the guests hadn't left yet. I stood my ground, and I told my mother that she had chosen to leave the previous night and that it had been completely her fault, so I was not going to make up for it by restarting my wedding for no reason. She started arguing with me and insisting that we do it her way, just so that her mother doesn't cut her off, because this was a huge deal and my grandma is all for family and familial bonds, and the only reason she wasn't present at my wedding was because of her health, since she had been seriously sick for a very long time. So if she was able to find out that my mom had done something so stupid, she wouldn't take a second before cutting her off. Also, I'm the only grandkid that she has and she adores me, so everyone knew that she would be very upset if she was to find out about what my mother had done, and that's why my mom was so desperate to fix the situation before my grandma was able to find out. I was not in the mood to fight with my mother at all, and my grandma kept trying to video call her, so I decided to call my maid of honor, grab my phone from her, and before my mother could say or do anything, I had FaceTimed my grandma so I could speak to her and tell her the truth because I was done with my mom and her whining. Obviously my grandma was happy to see me, and after some small talk about the wedding and how successful it was, I got to the point, and I told her exactly what had happened with my mother and how she was trying to trick her by insisting that I restart my wedding just for her. I did all of this right in front of my mother and she was literally frozen in place, so when I turned the phone around, so my grandma could face her, she had nothing to say, and my grandma yelled at her for a solid 6 minutes before telling her that she had really disappointed her. And then, just as everyone had expected, she told my mother that it was not necessary for her to come back home that year for the holidays and that my grandma didn't want to speak to her until I had forgiven her, and only then would she even consider making things right with my mom again. Then, my grandma wished me luck and hung up. And all this while, my mom had just been frozen in place along with James, and neither of them had anything to say. After my grandma had hung up, I thought that they were going to have an outburst at me, but luckily, they didn't say anything and just left after a couple of minutes without a word. That was great, because if they had decided to throw a tantrum, then, it would have ruined my reception. For the rest of the day, we decided that we were not going to talk about my mom and James because we didn't want them to ruin our evening. The day after the wedding, after we had come back home, my grandma finally called me up again so we could discuss what had happened since the day of my wedding. She had tried to keep things as short as possible because she didn't want me to miss out on the reception or anything. But now that I was back, she could speak to me properly, and she told me that apparently, she had been having a hard time with my mom for the past couple of months anyway, because of her decision to marry James. My grandma had been strongly against the idea of it right from the beginning because they had only known each other for a couple of months, and she didn't think that it was a good idea for her to rush into a marriage like this, which was quite natural, but my mom didn't pay any attention to her. Then, they ended up not speaking for a couple of months after her wedding because my grandma had said that it was a stupid decision and my mom had taken offense at it. After a few months, though, my mother herself apologized to my grandma and visited her along with James to make things right, but James himself had been quite aloof around my grandma, and even though she had nothing against him, had actually been quite nice to him. He had constantly acted like he was too good to be speaking to his mother-in-law and had rejected all her attempts at trying to get to know him. So she had already had a bad feeling about him, and after that visit, she started disliking him even more. And she had told my mom about it, and they had been bickering about this for the past couple of months. My mom constantly kept playing the same card, that her parents had thought that my dad was the right guy for her, but when she got married to him, he turned out to be the worst mistake of her life because she really couldn't stand him. But now, she felt like my grandmother was refusing to give James a real chance to fit into the family simply because they hadn't been together for a long time. My grandmother insisted that she had given him a real chance, that she hadn't even had anything against him in particular, and had it been any other guy in his place, she would have said the same thing, that it was too soon to be getting married, but for some reason, James seemed to be the kind of person who had taken it personally, had chosen to have an attitude around my grandma, which led to even more amongst them. Things had already been pretty bad for the past couple of months between my mom and my grandma, and then, the recent FaceTime call on the day of my wedding was pretty much the last straw for my grandma because she couldn't believe that my mom had decided to skip my wedding just because I wouldn't let James walk me down the aisle. Neither of us knew whose idea it actually was, James or my mom's, but it didn't matter because she had chosen to skip my wedding and then tried to act like none of that had happened and tried to get me to read everything so that my grandma wouldn't be able to find out. After discussing all of this, both of us realized that my mom had been acting weird and behaving quite badly with both of us. She had taken both her own mom and her daughter for granted, and that was not going to fly with us anymore. So on the phone call, my grandma and I decided that we were not going to be speaking to her for the next couple of months until we felt that we were able to forgive her, or at least until she apologized to both of us sincerely, because right now, things were too heated. My grandma sent my mom a message on our behalf, saying that she didn't want her reaching out to either of us until we were ready to speak to her, and she hoped that she would respect it. I thought it was a reasonable reaction to expect after whatever had happened. But instead, my mom started blaming me for this entire situation and sent me a bunch of really bitter messages last evening. She believed that apparently it was my fault that even her own mother was not speaking to her anymore, and she thought that I had made matters worse for my mom on purpose. She said that if I hadn't wanted to redo the wedding, I could have just said so, which I did several times, but she wasn't willing to listen. Anyway, she just thinks that I took it way too far by contacting my grandma on the day of the wedding and telling her everything just to create more trouble on purpose, and even now, she said that there was no need for me to discuss things with my grandma and give her more reason to be pissed at my mother because it felt like I was recruiting people to turn against her, and she didn't think that it was fair since I had no reason to drag my grandma into any of this and gang up on her. I feel like she's just being whiny about all of this again, but she might have a point. So Ida for dragging my grandma into a fight with my mother? Update 1. Thank you to everybody who left supportive comments on my post. I decided to just block my mother and put an end to this because I didn't need to entertain her. She has been acting strange and crazy ever since she started seeing James, and I don't need this in my life anymore. I want to have a happy and peaceful time as newlyweds, and by the end of next week, my husband and I are not even going to be here. We are going to be sightseeing in Paris, which I know is kind of cliched, but that's where we are going for our honeymoon, and I want to remove any sort of negativity from my mind before heading out. I don't want to carry this burden of having to worry about what my mother is feeling and going through even when I'm trying to enjoy myself, and the best way to ensure that is just to block her and make sure that she has no access to me and that I don't have to hear what she has to say anyway. My entire life, I have tried my best to make sure that I show her the same kind of love and respect that I have shown my father so that she doesn't feel left out, because I would honestly feel bad if that happened, but now, I don't feel that anymore. After all, my dad has always treated me a lot better than she has, and so, I don't think I have to treat her the same way. I think that would be actually unfair. I have discussed whatever she said with my grandma, my dad, and my husband, and all of them think that I have the right idea about blocking her, and most of them actually believe that I should have done it a long time ago. Pretty much on the day of the wedding itself, but I had waited because it was really hard for me to give up on the idea of having a good relationship with my mother, but now, it has to be done. I can't allow her to treat me like this and get away with it, and I'm going to make sure that I do that now. Update 2. Hey, guys. So my husband and I are going to be leaving for our honeymoon tomorrow, and I guess I must have mentioned that to my mother at some point because she seemed to remember. I don't know what to feel about what just happened, but anyway, I'm just gonna put it out here since I feel like I need to keep you guys updated. In my last update, I mentioned that I have blocked my mother everywhere and she doesn't have access to me. So she decided to send an email to my work email address since I hadn't blocked her there because I didn't think that she would reach out to me at that address. Anyway, I had initially decided that I would just delete the email, but eventually, curiosity got the better of me and I ended up opening and reading it. I read it along with my husband, and by the end of it, both of us were feeling quite weird. Because in the email, my mother had talked about how much she loved me and how much she regretted treating me badly recently, because the only reason she had wanted James to walk me down the aisle was because he had insisted upon it. Even when they were getting married, she was not the one who had suggested it, and she had even tried to hold it off for a couple of months so they could get to know each other better, but James had talked her into doing it. And also, on the night before the wedding, it was James who had manipulated my mother into thinking that people would get the wrong message if my father ended up walking me down the aisle with her, and so, he wanted to replace my dad with himself. She had kept defending him all throughout because she loved him, but she said that she loved me and she really regretted everything that she had done because she felt like she was caught in between James and her family, and now, she could really sympathize with how I used to feel back when I was a kid, as a child of divorce. She mentioned that James could be a tad bit controlling when he wanted to, but she didn't usually mind it. However, now, both of them had been talking for a couple of days and had acknowledged the fact that it was his controlling nature that had led to so much trouble for her in the family. So he has promised to work on that and not make her feel guilty, and she has also promised him that she's going to stand up for herself when she feels the need to and isn't going to just be a doormat for him constantly. She ended the email by saying that she would really want to get back in touch with us once we came back from our honeymoon and told us to enjoy it to the fullest. But that's not what I'm concerned about. I'm just worried that maybe he's not the right guy for my mom. I know that in the email, she said that the two of them had decided that they were going to work on it and that James had acknowledged that he had issues with control, but I don't know how much of that is true. The way she made it sound, it felt like James was not a good guy and she was just trying to cover up for him. But my husband and I are leaving for our honeymoon tomorrow, so we can't deal with this right now. We thought about it for a while and ultimately, we just decided that it would be better to let her deal with this. I've informed my dad about it because I know that no matter how much he says that he dislikes my mom, he's not going to let any harm come to her because he's just a decent person. And just for good measure, I've also told one of her close friends about it, and I know that she's not gonna gossip because they've been friends since my mom was a child. So I'm sure that even when I'm not here, she's going to be taken care of and I can have a worry-free honeymoon. Update 3. Hey. So this is going to be a relatively short update. About 4 months ago, I had posted my last update here, and at the time, my husband and I had left for our honeymoon. We thought that we were going to deal with whatever was going on with my mom and James after we had come back, but when I tried to email my mother after I came back from our honeymoon a couple of days later, I told her that I would be willing to speak to her, but I never got a response. I even spoke to her friends and they told me that she seemed happy enough, so I figured that maybe there was nothing really wrong and I let it go because I got busy with work and stuff. Fast forward to 2 weeks ago, I heard back from my mother again and she told me that she was really thankful that I had told her friend that I had my doubts about James, especially when she hadn't had the guts to do so. I was right, James was definitely not the right guy for her and had kind of been trying to isolate her from everyone by asking her to cut everybody off. Eventually, he even told her that he didn't want her hanging out with her childhood friend because according to him, she was problematic and nosy, and after my mother canceled plans to meet her almost 4 times in a row, Her friend realized that there was something fishy going on, and there was also the email that I had spoken to her about. 2 weeks back, her friend finally confronted her, and my mother ended up breaking down and told her everything. James had been treating her really badly and she couldn't take it anymore. So her friend decided to support her, and together, the two of them filed for divorce, and she has been living with her friend ever since she had ended the lease on her previous apartment and moved in with James after they got married. My mom reached out to me to thank me for looking out for her and telling her friend about him and what my mom had said in her email, so she had some idea about the reality of the situation, because otherwise, she didn't think anybody would have been able to guess that she was going through something. Anyway, I'm glad that she's getting out of the situation now, and hopefully, we will all be able to make things better. Even my grandma was quite shocked by this revelation, but we are trying to be there for my mom, and we all just really hope that things work out.